when you start looking onto land issues in the context of peace building or transitional justice or from a human rights perspective, you'll often be looking at issues related to land disputes. Very often, I said at the outset, there's almost no conflict in the world that doesn't generate some form of displacement. Very often these land disputes are related to displacement, but not only. And I will discuss them mostly in the context of land dispute, in the context of displacement. But some of the issues that I mentioned are also applicable if they're not particularly related to forced large-scale displacement. Now, let me first talk about land disputes, a little bit about the characteristics. Then I want to talk a little bit about what are the institutions that can resolve those land disputes. And then I want to move into the substantive part of it. When there's been dispossession and when there's been land disputes around dispossession of land during conflict, what are some of the substantive ways that one can respond to that, and some of the upsides and maybe some of the downsides of the common practice of the international community, and especially when it comes to what particular solutions we are promoting. First of all, I think there needs to be a word of caution. When you come into a post-conflict environment or a transitional environment, very often you'll hear, oh, there's an enormous amount of land disputes. Ooh, it's incredible, it's incredible. And there's land disputes there, and there's land disputes there, and there's land disputes there. I think first we have to take a step back and say every society has land disputes. And what you will have in any environment is you'll have very ordinary land disputes to which we as the international community or as actors engaged in peace building don't necessarily need to pay too much attention to, sitting alongside land disputes that I would call extraordinary in nature and which are the ones that we need to look at. But it's very important not to overreact and to see every single land dispute as a potential source for new conflict or social instability or a threat to peace going forward. For example, it's very common in rural areas to have boundary disputes. These boundary disputes are there all the time. They're there in peaceful societies, they're there in conflict societies. It doesn't mean because there's a boundary dispute between two farmers that all hell is going to break loose and that peace agreements cannot be implemented. So I think first of all, the first task needs to be, and that's empirical work, is to understand what are the land disputes that are extraordinary in nature and the ones that we need to look at, and which are the ones that are ordinary in nature, which we can sit on the side and keep an eye on to make sure that they don't turn into something else. The core characteristics of these extraordinary land disputes, what are they? Well, the first one, obvious, is related to the conflict and or the peace dividend ones. For example, if you have large-scale return of displaced populations that are coming into areas that have been occupied during the conflict by other people, these are not ordinary land disputes, and clearly these are land disputes that we need to look at. When in Iraq, you have a sudden influx of returnees, Kurdish and Turkmen returnees after 2003, going into areas where Sunnis were relocated by Saddam in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. You clearly do not have an environment that is a normal land dispute environment. Conflicts that have a high political sensitivity and significance. For example, in Yemen, some of the conflicts that are the highest significance are the ones that are related to land grabbing in the past by the military leadership in the south. These are not land disputes that can be resolved simply by a civil court. These require particular attention. They're directly related to the ability of the north and the south of Yemen to stay together, for example. The numbers of land disputes may be so large that they exceed what is normal. The disputes in and by themselves may not be so particular, but they may be so large that the existing institutions, which, as I said earlier, may be weakened, can no longer absorb them. And then the caseload as such becomes really an extraordinary caseload that needs to be addressed to avoid that these land disputes turn into something else. Land disputes in that sort of a catch-all category that have the potential to undermine peace building and recovery if not addressed. This is something, again, that is context-bound and that is sort of an open category. But so it's very important to understand, first of all, what are these extraordinary land disputes and what are the ones that we need to focus on. Of course, again, these categories are not set in stone, and ordinary land disputes may become extraordinary. For example, if, as I said already, land dispute mechanisms are so weakened that they can no longer absorb those, then these land disputes need to be looked at. Then, when we think about what type of mechanisms can be used to deal with these extraordinary land disputes, we first can look at what are the principal dispute resolution mechanisms that we could we, when I say we, it's of course the national government, but we, as in the international community, working together with the national government, can be promoting. The first is mediation, the second is adjudication. Mediation, and you can read the definition in the slide that I have on this, is the process that assists parties to voluntarily negotiate a mutually acceptable resolution and involves the assistance of a third party, the mediator. Adjudication is the process whereby an authority makes a binding decision and says to the parties, this is what is decided, please go away, and now this particular decision needs to be implemented. What of these two, there's a very long debate that we could have, and we don't have time in the 45 minutes that we have in the lecture, on what works best in the conflict and transitional environment, and there's a lot of different factors that you need to look at. But I think one important element is when you look at what institutions to support. Should you support adjudication bodies, or should you support more bodies that are working on mediation? Is that you do a conflict impact assessment of those both mechanisms. For example, if in the Central African Republic you've had, and maybe before the conflict these tensions were not so high, but now they're definitely there, very high tensions between Christians and Muslim communities. Is it a good idea in the transitional environment, if they would have a land conflict, to have them confront each other in a court and have a judge say this is what needs to happen? Or is it better for those two people to need to sit together and to negotiate, talk to each other, and come away with a solution that they can both live with from a social cohesion, from a peace-building perspective? So as long as one integrates a sort of a conflict peace-building impact assessment on what methodology is being used, I think that is one of the most important elements. What are the institutions that can resolve land disputes? And I think sometimes we have the idea, and there are still far too many rule of law programs that focus particularly on courts. Let me say this very clearly. In most countries, or in many countries that I've worked in, that are countries in transition, that are countries that come out of conflict, courts play very, 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 very limited role in resolving land disputes. They often have very high land dispute case loads, but that is different from providing a role in resolving land conflicts in a durable way. It's not a realistic option if you have extraordinary land disputes to think that just by having more judges in a court, or very often rather, because again this is context bound, very often it's not a realistic option to think that the courts are going to be the ones that are going to provide the solution. But of course they are one of the institutions that can resolve land disputes. But there's also the customary or traditional authorities, which I already mentioned earlier in my presentation. There's civil society actors and NGOs, local, international. NGOs like the Norwegian Refugee Council have build up a huge expertise in dealing with mediation in land disputes, for example. Local governments can play a very important role. National government ministries can play an important role as well. In Western Côte d'Ivoire, for example, the sous-préfets, which are the representatives of the national government in the regions, play an enormously important role as part mediator, part adjudicator in resolving land disputes in the communities, despite the fact land disputes falls under their broad mandate, that they're not specialized in, or that their role is not merely land disputes. They spend currently 90% of their time in some areas on mediating and adjudicating land disputes. So there's local government, national government. Political leaders can sometimes be very important to broker deals around very important and high-profile land issues. And of course you have land commissions, and I'll come back to land commissions maybe later on if there is time. National, international, or hybrid commissions like the ones established, the Property Claims Commission in Iraq, the Land Commission, and the Land Commission in Yemen, for example. In addition to the institutions that actually resolve disputes, it's very important to see, especially when you look at providing international support, that there's also a whole range of institutions that play a supporting role to resolve land disputes. And very often what you see, and I've seen this in a number of different countries where a particular authority, a new authority is established to deal with extraordinary land disputes, all the international attention goes to that body, to the Land Commission in Yemen, to the Land Commission in the Property Claims Commission, to the Ministry of Agriculture in Colombia. But there's a lot of other institutions that are around there that will need to do additional work on top of their normal work to support the work of these specialized entities dealing with extraordinary land disputes, and they need to be supported as well. They need to be supported as well for at least two reasons. First, because they need to have the resources to do the additional work. And secondly, and we're all bureaucrats. I'm a bureaucrat, you're a bureaucrat. We all know what happens when other agencies believe that we are being unfairly advantaged by the national government in terms of budget. It means that collaboration across institutions usually becomes much more complicated. And I've seen this happening in a number of different countries where you have those institutions. They have the best cars, they have the best computers, they get taken to trainings internationally the whole time. And then the person in the cadastre, which is one of the institutions, or the property registration department, that is an assistant, or that is an institution that needs to help those commissions to deal with their land claims, is like, really? You expect me now to come here and help you? I've never been taken on a training. I don't have a computer. I'm writing everything on a piece of paper. I don't have a car. So these dynamics are very important. What are those institutions? Cadastre, I already said, property registration department. A variety of national and local authorities that may need to be involved, either to provide information, to issue certificates, whatever it is that they need to do. Security sector, police, army. In Iraq, for example, the Property Claims Commission issues a decision of land restitution. Then, if the person who loses out doesn't want to leave, it's the police that has to go. Is the police aware of the land restitution process? Has the police been given the means to deal with these sort of issues? Is the police maybe the right entity to do this to begin with in a very sensitive environment? These things need to be looked at. Bar associations, legal aid organizations, do they have the resources to provide assistance to people who want to access the process? Or, and that's the other side of the coin, have they been lobbying to make the procedures so legally complicated that people can only access the process with legal representation, which in, I think, transitional environments should be avoided to the extent that it's possible. Civil society and NGOs can play an important role, of course, in terms of supporting these type of processes. And then you have a broad range of land and property experts, like surveyors, for example, who may need to play a role in resolving these sort of extraordinary land disputes. So, again, the main lesson I think there is that you need to understand the holistic picture, and there is a chapter in the book that you have on the reading list that I've written on resolving land disputes in transitional environments that specifically focuses, and it has a drawing, you will see, of how many institutions are involved in the Iraq process, for example. But it's very important to make these type of drawings before you decide as an international aid agency what you're going to support, to make sure that you support the whole process and not the other process. Because the legitimacy of the institution that is doing the land dispute resolutions is critical for people to continue to believe that their land disputes will be resolved. And it's negatively affected if none of their decisions get enforced because of the fact that the other institutions are not working together. When you look at Yemen, for example, the Yemen Land Commission can only issue recommendations. It's then up to the President's office to make sure that the decisions get implemented. But the Land Commission suffers from the fact that no decisions are being implemented, despite the fact that they are not the ones that are responsible for it.